Hi guys, it's Penguin Design here, bringing you another exciting tutorial on how to make games in Unity. This time we'll be focusing on creating the ever popular indie genre of platformers. So what we're going to be doing is creating a simplified version of Super Mario Bros. And to begin with, what we're going to be doing in this episode is creating the first part of the first level. So that would be referred to as 1-1. And we will make our player have basic controls, so move left to right and be able to jump, as well as implementing a nice collision system with a combination of Unity 3D and 2D. So what we're going to do is open up Unity 5. So as always, you can download it from a link in the description, and everything we're doing can be done completely for free. So I'm going to open up Unity 5 and I'm going to hit New Project, and now you can name this whatever you want, but I'm going to call it Platformer. Okay, and just leave its type to 3D and hit Create Project. So once Unity's loaded, you'll be presented with a screen that looks like this. And one little change I like to make is to click on the game window and drag it out so that we can see both the game and scene view. So what we're going to do is, in our project view, hit Create, Folder, and call this Materials. In this Materials folder, we're going to create a few materials. So the first of which will be called Hill, and you'll see what this is in a second. Most important though is under shader to check unlit color, and you can choose a nice dark green color. So what I'm going to do is hit game object, create 3D object cube, and as you'll see in your scene and game view, it's created a cube. So for this cube, I'm going to set its scale to be 5, and I'm going to drag in the hill material. Now I'm going to duplicate it by clicking on it in the hierarchy or scene view, whatever you prefer, and pressing the shortcut Control D. Now I'm going to increase it on the y-axis by 1 and set its X scale to be 3. Now I'm going to repeat this process and this time make its scale 1. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click game object, create 3D object cube, and down in my materials folder I'm going to create a new material and I'm going to call this ground. Okay, once again check unlit color and choose an orangey brown color. So now for this cube that we just created, drag in the ground material by clicking and dragging onto the inspector, and I'm going to set its X scale to be 40, its Y position to be -1, and its position on the X-axis to be 17.5. I'm going to duplicate this object and set its XY position to be -2. So now what I'm going to do is, before I continue building this level, I'm going to set up the camera. So what we're going to do is, under our camera, select under clear flags, choose solid color, and choose a nice light blue sort of color. Under projection, check orthographic. As you'll remember from most 2D games, this works. And set its size to be about 9.5. Now what you can do is, in the hierarchy, double click on the main camera and drag it along with these arrows so that the edge of those shapes correlates. So that would be about 14.5 and 7. Okay. So now I'm going to continue creating the level, and what this level is based off is Mario 1-1. So if you type this in on Google Images, you'll be presented with what we're going to be creating. And so what I'm going to do is try my best to just replicate this first part. So the process I'm going to be taking to do this is, I'm going to, for example, if I was going to replicate this bush here, what I do is I'd go game object, create 3D object cube. I'm actually going to set its z-axis to be 1 because it's actually supposed to be behind the level, and this would go the same for the hill. So set that to be 1. And so to do it, I would then go in the materials folder, hit create material, and call this bush. Under shader, select unlit color, choose a lighter green color, and now set its transform properties to correlate with its position. So it should be about there. Its X scale should be 3 and material should be bush. So what I'm going to do is keep repeating this throughout this whole level. And for example, the cloud bush objects, they'll have a Z position of 1 and the others will have a Z position of 0. So for now we're not going to create this mushroom or Goomba, but we will create Mario. So what I'm going to do is time-lapse this, and you can follow along on your computer at home because this isn't a very difficult process. So finally, I'm going to hit create material and I'm going to call this player. I'm going to go up to shader, unlit, color, choose an appropriate color, and then go game object, 3D object, cube. And I'll set its position to be about 4 on the y-axis, and I'll drag in the player material. So although that isn't the full level, that's a good basis. So that's about this proportion. And that'll be good enough for a little testing ground for the first few episodes until we start implementing things like enemies, going down pipes, but for now it'll be good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to organize this because as you can see this is a complete mess. Although it looks good in the game, it's really not good to have this all disorganized like this. So what I'm going to do is use a shortcut called Ctrl-Shift-N, and this will create an empty game object. So I'm going to set its position to be 0 on each axis, and I'm going to call this bush. So what I'm going to do is under bush, I'm going to select all the hills and bushes. Okay, I've selected them all. Now what I'm going to do is drag them under this object, which I called bush. And this is still unneat, so I'm going to select all the hills and call them hill, hitting enter and call this cube. I'm going to call this bush. So what I'm going to do is repeat this process with all of these cubes so that it's a little bit more organized. And what we can do now is actually delete this directional light because it's unnecessary. And I'm just going to close up all of these groups that we've created, and so we're left with these major groups, which we can in fact put in a big group called level. So I'm going to drag all of these in, and now we're left with our player and main camera, which are the most important parts. So first what we're going to be doing is making the player jump around and be affected by physics, and then we're going to make the camera follow the player. But first there's a few things that we need to set up. What we're going to be doing is using 2D physics. So what we're going to do is in our player, where it says box collider, hit remove component, and then onto this add component menu, click physics 2D, box collider, okay. And under physics 2D again, we're going to add a rigid body. So this is for our player. And what we're going to do is in the rigid body, we're going to change a few of its properties. So we're going to check fixed angle, going to change its gravity to 5. Now the reason I do this is because if you don't do it, it sort of feels like your character's walking on the moon. And finally, we're going to set collision detection to continuous. This just means that it won't get stuck in blocks when it's falling down. So all of that looks good, but there's one more thing that we have to do, and that is in our project view, we're going to hit folder, create folder, call this physics, and under this we're going to hit create physics 2D material, and I'm going to call it player, but you can call it whatever you want. And I'm going to set its friction to 0. So this will just come in handy later. I'll explain it later once we write some code. So what I'm going to do to make sure that this is being used is in our player object, I'm going to click on it and drag in this physics material under the material selection of the Box Collider 2D. What I'm going to do now is expand all of these groups that we just made. And first of all the objects that we don't want to have a physics applied to them, I'm going to select using control. So that would be the clouds and all of these hills. Okay, so I'm going to, under Box Collider, just click remove component. Okay, so now what I'm going to do, all of these objects that we do want to apply physics to, I'm going to select them. And again, I'm going to go to Box Collider and hit remove, but I'm going to hit add component physics 2D and then Box Collider, okay? Because we are, as I said before, going to be using 2D physics. So now you can go ahead and close up all these groups that you made, and we can start coding, I believe. Oh, actually, what I'm going to do before I start that is, for our collision, what I'm going to do is add another physics 2D Box Collider to our player object, and I'm going to change this one's properties a bit. I'm going to check is trigger, and under size I'm going to make it about 0.9 on the X and 1.1 on the Y. So this will come in handy later, and that's because what we want to happen is if there's anything inside this collider, then our player is touching the ground, and that's why the collider protrudes out from the object a bit. Okay, but it will again make a bit more sense later. What I'm going to do is in our root folder, hit create folder and call this scripts, and this is where we're going to be writing code. So I'm going to be writing in C# because it's frankly a good basis language. So I'm going to call this player controller. Oops, if I can spell it right. And what I'm going to do is double click on this, and it will open up in MonoDevelop. So what we can do is delete these comments because they're not seen by the computer, and they just make things a little bit more messy. What we're going to do is define some variables. So if you're new to programming, a variable basically just stores a piece of data. So what I'm going to do is use a double backslash and write movement. And so this is just a comment to the coder, which is me and you. And the computer doesn't read this. It sees these double backslash and it says, okay, I'll ignore everything after this. And this will just help us understand our code a bit better, because if you come back to your code in, say, 6 months, it will be really hard to understand unless you have these comments here. So I'm going to define a public, which means that we can see it in the Unity editor, and a few more things, but yeah, and it's going to be a float, which means it's basically just a decimal, and I'll call this speed. Again, I'll define another public float, and this will be called jump. And what we're going to use is semicolons to tell the computer go to the next line. So now I'm not going to write public before it, and so I could write private, which is the opposite of public, but if you don't write anything, then it defaults at making it private. So I'm going to call this move velocity, semicolon, and now I'm going to write double backslash and go grounded variables, and so these will be the variables that are to do with grounding the player, which means checking if the player is touching the ground. So this will only be one, and it will be a bool, which means it's true or false, and it will be called grounded, and by default we want it to be true. So now what we can do is delete this void start, and now we're left with void update. So void update is called once every frame of the game, and so inside this we're going to be doing the majority of our code. So first I'm going to write the jumping code. So what I'm going to do is create an if statement, so by writing if, and then inside the parentheses we have the condition. So we're going to use input using a capital I dot get key down, make sure to have key down, and then I'm going to use key code dot space. So that will be checking if they've pressed the space bar, right? But some people like to use the up arrow, some people like to use W, some people like to use Z. So how we can have multiple conditions is we can use shift and then the forward slash, so this will make two straight lines, and this just means or. So what I'm going to do is select this and hit Control C to copy it and paste it, and here I'm going to write key code dot up arrow. Again I'm going to go straight thing, key code dot Z, oops, and finally this one will be key code dot W. So now I'm going to create a pair of curly braces, and inside these curly braces, so if they've pressed any of these keys, we want this code to execute, and that code will be Rigidbody 2D.velocity, right? Well, no, in Unity 5 they've updated the coding system a bit, and first you need to get the component of the Rigidbody. So you're going to write GetComponent Rigidbody 2D, and now you're going to have these opening and closing parentheses to say that it is a function, and we're going to write dot velocity equals, looks like I spelled component wrong, component dot velocity equals, and now I'm going to say new vector 2, so this means a new position in 2D space, so that's it's got an X and a Y axis. So on the X axis we actually don't want it to do anything, so we would write 0, but that will affect its movement a bit. So what we actually want to do is copy this GetComponent and paste it in the first part and write .x, and this means that whatever its X position is, set that to be the first X position, so it won't affect it. And we want to set its Y position to be the jump variable that we defined. Okay, so I'm going to save this just for now, go back into Unity, check for errors. Okay, looks like we have a passing error, and yep, I can obviously see one. I've missed out on one curly brace. Hit save using Control S, go back into Unity, don't worry about those unassigned variables, and hit play. Oops, before I do that, we're going to, in our project view, drag in our player script and set this jump variable to be, let me think, say for example 23. Hit play, and so now if we press space, our character jumps or up or Z or W, but as you can see he can just keep jumping forever. And also we also want him to be able to move left and right, so there's a few more things that we're going to have to do. So what we're going to do is in this if statement, we're going to check if the grounded variable that we defined up here is equal to true, then execute this. So right now it's always equal to true, so it won't make any difference to the code. But later on, we're going to set it to be true and false depending on the player's position. But just leave that as it is now, and what we're going to be doing is left and right movement. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to write an if statement, and in its condition I'm going to go input dot get key. Notice I'm not using get key down, I'm using get key, and that's because get key is called every frame that this key is down, whereas get key down is called only once, and that's for an obvious reason. So under the get key, I'm going to use key code dot left arrow, dot left arrow, or using that we used before, I'm going to copy this and replace it with key code dot a. So now in its condition, what we're going to do is set the move velocity variable to be equal to negative speed, and that's just because x going left is negative x and going right is positive x. So what I'm going to do is copy this whole chunk and paste it, and we'll rename all of these to be right arrow, and key code dot d, and just make this positive speed. And so this will mean that if they're pressing left, then move velocity will be equal to negative whatever this speed variable is, and vice versa. So now we got to set this so that it actually affects the player. So we're going to use Getcomponent. As you remember, that's the new Unity 5 thing that you have to do whenever referring to a component of an object. So this will be a Rigidbody 2D, and this is because we have this component under our object. So Rigidbody 2D, and we're going to adjust its properties. So again, we're going to use dot velocity and set this to be a new vector 2. So on the x-axis, which means horizontal, we're going to set it to be move velocity, and on the y-axis we want it to be GetComponent dot Rigidbody 2D dot velocity dot y. Add a semicolon, and that's working. Okay, so hopefully if we press save, go back into Unity, and under our player object, set the speed to be about 7, hit play, and hopefully now you should be able to move and jump. So now the one, and collide with other objects. So now the one issue that we need to fix is that he's sliding forever, which is sort of not what we want. And second of all, it's that you can jump forever. So obviously those are two things that we need to fix. So in order to fix the sliding forever issue, up here I'm going to set move velocity to be equal to 0. Hit save, go back into Unity, and press play, and so now when we let go, we stop. And finally, we're going to have to consult this issue of basically being able to fly like a Flappy Bird or something. Okay, so it's actually not too tricky to fix that issue. And we're going to be using a different function, two in fact. So these are going to be, first I'm going to use double backslash and write check if grounded. So this is just a little note to myself and you guys. And so this is going to be a new function. So you start the function with void if it doesn't have a type, and this has to have this name. It's got to be on trigger enter 2D, and it has to be capitalized like that. So that means if this trigger collider that we made here, if there's an object inside that collider, so in here, then execute this code, and that will be the grounded is equal to true. And if it's not, the trigger is not touching something, I'm going to copy this and go on trigger exit 2D and set grounded to be false. So I'm pretty sure that will be working. We'll hit save, and actually before we do that, in our assets folder, hit create folder and call this scenes. Hit Ctrl S, and in our scenes folder, call this 1-1. And now if we press play, we won't be able to jump forever. As you can hear, I'm pressing my space bar and it only lets me jump once I am touching the ground. And also we fixed the sliding issue. So I think that's as good time as any to stop the episode. And in next episode, what we're going to be doing is making it so that we have an enemy over here who walks towards us, and maybe if we get around to it, we'll implement when you jump and hit these coins, you get some money and they change color. But for now, let's call it a day, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you very much.